So it has become something of a forum tradition over the past couple of years for Aurora to inject a little bit of modeling into our collective thinking today. And in doing so, we very much hope to keep with the strategic big picture focus, but nonetheless show you some data. So in a sense, it's an opportunity for us to zoom out, reflect, and be a little bit provocative. And I think the topic that we have today is very much keeping in that tradition. Because what I want to talk to you about is the subsidy-free revolution. The emergence on a large scale in Europe and in Northwest Europe in particular of renewables that do not require any form of subsidy to break even and to make the economics work. And I think the word revolution is befitting, not just because of the sheer scale and sheer impact, which I will show you in a second, but also because it's a market departure from the old paradigm when terawatt hours of renewables capacity, of renewables generation, was always driven by the government will, by the government intervention. From that world, this revolution brings a new paradigm where decarbonization, where renewables can be brought about by the sheer market force. Okay, so let's see what we're actually going to be talking about. So firstly, I would like to tell you a little bit about the revolution itself, how it's going to play out, how big it is. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about the broader market impacts. What does it mean for everyone involved? And thirdly, I'll talk to you a little bit about the challenge. And it says challenges, but really is just one challenge, the challenge of financing this new model of deploying renewables. And the challenge is big, but as I will show you, there is potential to overcome it. Okay, so let's start from the revolution. And I think a good place to start is to recap what's been happening over the past 12 months. And the reason why it's a good idea to start here is because 2017 and the past 12 months have been something of a watershed moment for subsidy-free renewables. Firstly, we've had the landmark auctions in Germany and in the Netherlands, the surprising bids by Ørsted and by EnBW. In onshore wind, we've had the massive 650 megawatt PPA-backed project in Sweden that's been delivered by Green Investment Group and GE. This is the largest onshore wind development in Europe, single-site onshore wind development in Europe, and it's possibly, quite likely, the largest PPA ever. So certainly a big development. Great strides made by solar in Southern Europe, in both Italy and Spain, with projects actually getting delivered in Italy on a subsidy-free basis. Big developments also in GB. Onshore wind has seen important announcements by RES, 140 megawatts pipeline of projects potentially to be delivered subsidy-free. And we've seen whirlwind power, which is supposed to come under a PPA. And solar, obviously the UNESCO truly subsidy-free, first truly subsidy-free project in GB, but also a pipeline of up to 4 gigawatts of potentially subsidy-free solar with the headline projects or with the kind of poster children of the Hive Energy project and Total Reactive Technologies, massive projects benefiting from economies of scale. So there's a lot going on, no doubt, but I think a skeptic could rightly say, well, there's a lot going on in terms of announcing the will to do subsidy-free renewables. There's a lot going on in terms of putting together projects. But if you look at the deployment itself, it hasn't yet been that overwhelming. If you look at the amount of corporate PPAs in Europe, that's still about 1 gigawatt. If you look at even the offshore wind auctions, the Ørsted bid, well, that really is just an option. It's not a guaranteed delivery. So there is some, maybe not reason to be skeptical, but one can claim we're not there yet. So we have to look at the economics, and that's what I intend to do. And I intend to do it looking at just one example of one technology in one country, but hopefully picking up on some of the themes that will be relevant to a broader spectrum of technologies. And that technology and that country is solar PV in Great Britain. And I would like to show you how that technology has been transforming over the past few years into a subsidy-free regime. Let's start this journey. Let's go a little bit in history to 2010. And 2010, mind you, wasn't a great time to be a solar developer in GB. Fresh after the financial crisis, DEC was introducing feed-in tariffs for the first time, and the alarmist British press was filled with headlines like, "Are we doing the next Energiewende? Is this madness of Germany repeated in GB?" So not a great time to be a solar developer, and if you looked at the economics, you can clearly see why. What we show here is the present value of revenues and costs. Your revenues would account for roughly £350 per kilowatt in 2010. Your costs were overwhelming, and as a result, if you wanted to deploy on a subsidy-free basis, you were 80% out of the money. So you were missing 80% of your costs. So back in 2010, few would have probably thought that by 2018, we'll be really on the cusp of what I argue is the subsidy-free revolution and on the cusp of viability for solar PV. And yet here we are. Because what's happened is this remarkable cost decrease, and we all know this story, but it's worth reminding ourselves once again that we've covered a vast majority of this road to subsidy-free already. In fact, we've covered almost 80% of that route measured from 2010. We're 80% there on the road to subsidy-free. Okay, so we've covered a long distance, but how does it convince us that we're going to get there? We reached the tipping point, we approached the tipping point, but are we going to get beyond the tipping point? So let's start from the minus £500 per kilowatt in present value in today's terms, and let's see what happens by 2025. Well, the first thing that's going to happen, and this isn't controversial, is cost is going to continue to fall. If solar continues its historical trajectory of roughly 21% cost decline for every doubling of capacity, then that's roughly the cost decline that we can expect during that period. It's pretty substantial. What is also going to happen is you're going to see a little bit of an increase in revenue. The reason for that is we expect the gas markets to recover, the oversupply in the LNG market especially to clear, and you will have rising carbon costs. But this increase, as you can see, is relatively small, and part of the reason why it is so small is because of cannibalization. This is obviously a well-known concept, but our solar PV farm that we're looking at isn't the only game in town. There's others who are going to come after it, produce during the same period, and as a result, undermine the economics of that project. But okay, we've got cost decreases, we've got revenue increases, and by 2025, we're really very close to subsidy-free, but not quite there yet. So what's going on here? Well, the last piece of this puzzle is in financing. At 13% discount rate, which is what we applied for this calculation of present value that you would have seen, this doesn't quite work yet by 2025. In fact, it only works by 2030, roughly. But if you decrease that cost of capital, if you manage to deploy a cost of capital of 8%, then indeed by 2025, we reach the grid parity. Now, it's easier said than done. It's a big challenge, and we dedicate a whole section to this, so I'm not going to jump ahead. But there are some signs to show that we are going to go to a world where this is perhaps feasible. We know that there's equity willing to be deployed on a kind of unlevered IRR hurdle rate of 8%. And we know that there is increasing willingness of debt to participate in these projects. So there is signs of optimism, and we indeed think that by 2025, solar will be very much in the money. Okay, so I said I'm going to give you one example to show the detail, but you can obviously apply this logic to all the other technologies, and we did. And in the GB context, what we find is that both solar and onshore wind become viable on a subsidy-free basis in the early 2020s. So but by 2025, we very much think that both of these technologies will be in demand and deployable without any government support. Offshore wind has a little longer to go, unsurprisingly. It's a more costly, less mature technology, but it's also going to get there by 2030 to 2035. Obviously, the exact date depends on your assumptions on capex in discount rates and a variety of other things, but we think that these are roughly the time scales that you should be looking at. Okay, so there's a big role to play for cost declines. There's some role to play for revenue increases and for financing. But there's also something else happening, and I've heard some speakers picking up on this, which is the innovation in business models. It's innovation in how these renewables are operated. And that's a very interesting development, a relatively recent one. I think two developments especially deserve attention. One is co-deployment with battery, and Nina has mentioned previously that we've seen indeed first projects in GB deploying subsidy-free on that basis. And certainly that can enhance the economics of certain projects. But it's perhaps not very scalable. Indeed, if you look at the economics of most of the solar projects, this isn't necessarily a solution that could be scaled universally and could be the answer to bring in projects forward earlier. But it certainly has a role to play. The other big innovation, I suppose, in operating renewables assets is revenue stacking. So in a much similar manner like you stack revenues for a battery project, you can do the same thing for something like offshore and onshore wind. And that's not the most intuitive thing, certainly, because when we think of onshore wind, when we think of offshore wind, you think, well, they create the need to balance, they create the need to be backed up, and they create the need to provide ancillary frequency response, for example. And yet, if you look at the technical capabilities of these technologies, what you also find is that all of them are able to partake in these markets, or they are able to be also part of the solution. And indeed, if you run the numbers, you will find that revenue stacking can be a very big boost to economics of renewables projects. We did a major study on this, and you can find the report. It's called The New Economics of Offshore Wind, with most of the industry involved. And that's, I suppose, the headline figure from this study. A 9% increase in 2035 for an offshore wind farm if its revenue stacks. Now, we're not there yet. This isn't a business model that's available right now that you can embark on and deploy tomorrow. There is an important policy change here behind that effectively enables that or allows wind to effectively revenue stack. You need to make sure that you allow wind to participate in the capacity market with appropriate derating factor. You have to ensure closer to real-time procurement of ancillary services. So there are quite a few changes, but this isn't just a pipe dream, because these changes are actually already happening. We've had the Burbo Bank project successfully trialing frequency response. We've had, in the most recent capacity auction, actually, onshore wind pre-qualifying paired with hydro. So these are very much live questions, and we think the policy direction is very much to enable that type of business models. And that matters, because from this study also, and I will show you that a little bit later, we find that revenue stacking can bring forward the date when offshore wind can deploy subsidy-free by around 5 years. And similar impact we expect for onshore wind. Okay, so we know that the economics can work, but we haven't really said anything yet about deployment, about how big is this revolution going to be. And this is quite a challenging question, because it's one thing to just look at this, assume something on cost reductions, assume something on price, and see where they cross and say, voila, here is where they become viable. It's an order of magnitude harder question to ask how much can deploy successfully, accounting for cannibalization, accounting for the fact that each additional megawatt changes the economics of the capacity deployed. So for that you need the model, and luckily we have one, which effectively loops between the price impact and deployment. And when we run this model, what we find out is that the size of this opportunity is really quite massive. Over 60 gigawatts of subsidy-free renewables will be deployed in Northwest Europe by 2030. By Northwest Europe, we mean these 6 countries that you can see in the top corner, so from Ireland to Germany. So over 40%, or almost 40% of all new renewable capacity that's going to come to the market by 2030, we expect to come on the unsubsidized basis. If you look at some of the detail, you'll see that it is dominated by solar and onshore wind, unsurprisingly. These are the technologies that are much closer to viability, as we know. And these are still aggregate figures, so I looked into some detail in their modeling. That's Ørsted's bets on offshore wind going subsidy-free. That is in the money in our model. So that gets built. That is part of this 13 gigawatts of offshore wind that you can see here. Another interesting fact from behind the hood, I suppose, is GB punches above its weight. It's got almost 18 gigawatts of subsidy-free deployment by 2030. And the reason for that is partly that it has low cannibalization, because simply the level of subsidized capacity that has come forward so far isn't yet enough to completely undermine the economics by cannibalizing the price of future projects. So some of the interesting facts from, I suppose, behind these headline figures. What does it mean in terms of spending? Well, 56 billion is how much we're going to invest in Northwest Europe, how much we expect to be invested in Northwest Europe by 2030 in subsidy-free renewables. So again, over a third of all investment, of all money spent, of all capex spent, will be on subsidy-free projects. But what is also an implication of this chart is that if you're not ready to invest, if you're not ready to finance subsidy-free projects, then you're missing out on a third of the market. Okay, so the revolution is here. It's quite substantial and certainly has big implications for the renewables investors. It increases the size of the prize for them by almost 50%. But it also has huge impacts for everyone else involved. And I will talk about them here a little bit. So if you ask yourself the question, what happens when you suddenly dump additional X terawatt hours of carbon-free power on the market, who wins, who loses? Well, I think the first answer that pops up for the losers camp is baseload capacity, is baseload gas capacity. And this really is quite simple. If you deploy more renewables, they produce more carbon-free terawatt hours. And by 2030, these carbon-free terawatt hours have to displace something else that's on the system. So it won't display nuclear, because nuclear also have zero or negative marginal cost. It will rather displace gas. And that's what we find. As gas production gets displaced, CCGTs operate lower load factors, bid higher in the capacity market, get less competitive. So quite a simple story, but I will show you what this actually means. I will show you how much of a reduction we can expect. But to put this number in the context, I also want to show you just how much our perception of CCGT and our expectations towards CCGT as a technology has shifted over the past few years. So if you look at 2012 DEC projections, that's from the gas strategy, CCGT was very much seen as the backbone of the GB power system. 22 gigawatts expected new build between 2017 and 2030, according to that gas strategy. And that view was very much held, at least until the first capacity market auction. Unsurprisingly then, we ended up with a pipeline of projects that currently amounts to something like 12 gigawatts. We've got 12 gigawatts of CCGTs ready to be built, ready to go. Well, times have changed quite a bit. The first 4 auctions, I think, have verified these expectations. And if you look at the government's latest projection from 2017, it only expects 7 gigawatts, and not of CCGT, but of gas. So that includes potentially reciprocating engines, of which 3 gigawatts are already delivered. So certainly the government's expectation has been adjusted here. If you look at our modeling, in which we don't allow subsidy-free renewables to come, this number is even smaller. It's 4 gigawatts of CCGT that we would expect in the system by 2030. And finally, if you include the subsidy-free renewables, this number drops to 1.4 gigawatts to be precise, of new CCGT by 2030. So within just 6 years, we have this radical refiguration of what CCGTs will mean in the power system of GB. Okay, so CCGTs are the loser, unsurprisingly. Someone has to be the winner, and as they become less competitive in the capacity market, someone else wins these capacity market contracts. Unsurprisingly, it's flexible capacity. What I mean by that is reciprocating engines, batteries, DSR, also OCGT, perhaps if regulation is changed with regards to embedded benefit. Up to 3 gigawatts of additional capacity can be deployed from that renewable subsidy, from that unsubsidized renewables boom. Obviously, flexible capacity also benefits in this scenario because the price volatility increases as you deploy more wind. So there's an additional boost to their competitiveness. What type of flexibility you will end up getting, and this is an interesting result that we keep seeing in pretty much every analysis that we do, very much depends on what type of renewables you will end up deploying. So in a scenario where wind is cheaper, but solar is more expensive, you will end up with more peaking capacities and less batteries. Conversely, if solar is cheaper, you end up with much more batteries and less peaking. Now, why is that the case? Solar and batteries are just great complements. The regularity of solar production means that battery has just enough of a spread and just enough of a dispatch opportunity and frequent enough dispatch opportunity for the economics to stack up. Conversely, solar benefits greatly from battery creating that additional demand when it charges during the day. So great compliments, and we can see it once again borne out by the results of this analysis. And apart from particular technologies and investors in particular technologies, that subsidy-free renewables boom also means a lot to the system and to some of the policy goals that the GB power market is striving to accomplish. And I think one of the ones which I suppose most exciting here, and come back to that shift in the paradigm that I described at the beginning, is the fact that you can get effectively market-driven decarbonization. That there's kind of bonus decarbonization. The government is doing nothing, and yet the system carbon intensity decreases by 20 grams of carbon equivalent by kilowatt hour by 2030 in the scenario that we've run. So this is really quite exciting. Okay, but I said there was one key challenge, and that challenge is in financing. How do you finance merchant renewables? How do you ensure that you can get the capital needed for that investment? Well, you might think this isn't really that different to the past. In the past, for example, under the ROC regime, you would have had a big merchant exposure as well. Well, the big break here is in the scale of it. So the fullness of merchant exposure, the fact that you no longer have a bit of subsidy there sitting to underpin your debts that you can lend against. And the second part of the challenge comes in the complexity of that merchant risk. What I will show you in a second is that the complexity of merchant risk increases quite dramatically as we go forward. So let's illustrate this point. If you deploy the wind farm in, let's say, 2005, obviously we're interested in what price you will get alongside your ROCs. But all you needed to know back then, was effectively what the fuel prices will be. And if you knew that, you could effectively tell very well what the resulting power price will be. And we show it here. If you look at the historical data, between roughly 2001 and 2017, the correlation between the baseload power price and the clean gas price is really quite striking. All you had to know the baseload price is roughly the price of gas and the price of carbon. Yes, you would have the odd spike of scarcity, but that wasn't a big deal, and if anything, it was an upside for someone like a wind farm. Now, of course, we're also interested in the capture price, and if you look at the capture price was following the baseload price. Cannibalization was minimal, and has been minimal for the past few years. So again, I think it's unsurprising that we as forecasters can always spot whether someone invests in winds, because the first question they literally ask is, what is your gas price forecast? Give me your gas price curve, and then I will know what your view in the market is. And this data bears it out very well. But times are about to change. And if you look at what's going to happen by 2030, two things are really going to happen. Firstly, we're going to have the decoupling of baseload electricity price from the clean gas price. You can no longer see the clean gas price or the fuel prices as the great predictor of baseload electricity price that they used to be. And secondly, the capture price of onshore winds will decouple from the baseload price itself even more. So we move from a world where all you had to know was the clean fuel price to know what price you're going to capture as a wind farm, to a world where you can know everything there is to know about the gas price and still not know what price you're going to capture. So that's a big, big shift and a big challenge for investors, because understanding these risks becomes crucial. And what I'd like to offer is a little bit of a, I suppose, a thinking or a solution to how you can make sense of these new complex risk environments. And what we find useful is to categorize these risks in 4 buckets. The first one is what you've just seen, the traditional merchant exposure, the exposure to changing fuel prices, to changing carbon prices. Secondly, cannibalization. How much of the same type of capacity is going to deploy and how much it will impact the capture prices. And thirdly, and that's often disregarded but will play an increasing role, is the system composition. So what type of system? Is it a flexible system or an inflexible system? Is it that renewables capacity is entering? So for example, if you have a high nuclear system, or if you have a system where the penetration of EVs is low, or the EVs are charged in a dumb way, all of it is now a risk to your capture price. It wasn't the case before, it certainly is the case now. And we've got some numbers to back this up. If you look at the impact on the onshore capture price in 2030, we've got 12 pounds per megawatt hour of an impact from the traditional merchant risk, almost as big an impact from cannibalization, and very substantial and individual impact from high nuclear and low flexibility, so from these system composition buckets that we talk about. So to know what price you will capture and to know the risks, you really have to think about all of these elements. And I presume that as you look at this, a lot of you will be thinking, well, how low can it go then? I mean, it's 46 in the base, and if you keep adding these negative impacts, you'll end up with, well, close to 0. Well, obviously, the trick is that that's not the way it works. These risks very much, you have to understand how they relate to each other. For example, in a world where the fuel prices are very low, it's unlikely that you'll have high renewables build-out, because it's unlikely that you'll build much subsidy-free, but it's also unlikely that the government will subsidize the lot, because that subsidy is suddenly very expensive. Similarly, if you have a high renewables build-out, it's unlikely that you'll have low flexibility, because flexibility responds to high renewables build-out. So accounting for all of these, for all these relationships, we find that in this case, you can establish a credible worst case for onshore wind capture price at around 30 pounds per megawatt hour in 2030. That hovers between 25 and 30 pounds throughout the 2030s in our projections. And why does it matter? Well, it matters because if you are to transact on these new merchant assets, and if you are to lend against these new merchant assets, you have to understand that one critical thing, which is what is your floor for the price? What is the amount of revenue that you're almost guaranteed to gain in this market and that you can lend against? So establishing a credible, realistic worst case is really quite critical. In the interest of time, seeing as I'm the only thing keeping you from lunch, I will skip the last slide and just go straight to the conclusions. And I want to leave you with 4 takeaways. Firstly, the subsidy-free revolution is here, and it's big. It's around £60 billion investment opportunity in Northwest Europe alone. Secondly, what this additional renewable capacity means is displacement of CCGTs on one hand, but also a boost to flexible capacities and opportunities in flexibility space. Thirdly, the nature of investment in unsubsidized renewables is radically different to what we've seen in the past, and it requires getting comfortable with increasingly complex merchant risks. And finally, there's a role for government. long-term policy clarity, ensuring level playing field and access to different markets, but also potentially subsidy-free CFDs could all be instruments that policymakers can pull, levers that policymakers can pull that can be effectively game changers for subsidy-free deployment. Thanks very much.